So I'm going to kick off the second half of this podcast with our great Gothic cathedral, the cathedral at Chartres, where we encounter in the famous West or Royal Portal, one of your required images, another Last Judgment. Now, this is actually a portion of Chartres that survived the fire of 1194. In other words, it dates from the Romanesque cathedral that was remodeled into a Gothic cathedral after the fire. But the south portal was carved 100 years later in the heart of the Gothic period, and here again we see a Last Judgment. There are differences in these two Last Judgment tympani. In particular, this tympanum from the south portal, the High Gothic, is carved in higher relief, and the figures are more interactive. Both are characteristics of Gothic sculptures. Still, these two portals should warn you against making too sharp a distinction between art historical periods. Textbooks and art historians love neat divisions. Art and real history don't always cooperate. But let's move away from sculpture and consider the famous Gothic stained glass of Chartres Cathedral. Here is a nativity scene. And here is Christ's presentation at the temple. And here is the entry into Jerusalem. Note that none of these is a required image, although Chartres Cathedral is, of course, in its entirety a required work. But it's interesting that of the 29 images in the bay of windows that depict the life of Christ, an astonishing 20 depict his birth, infancy, or childhood. So what does this tell us about the Gothic era? This is the great age of Christian humanism, and Chartres' Christ, at least the one who appears in stained glass, is human enough to have been a helpless baby and a young child. This is also an age when the adoration of Mary assumes central importance in the Christian faith. I'm going to return to that in just a few minutes. In the Chartres panel, we saw images of Christ that showed a little more of his humanity, but nothing like the emotional horror of this dramatic work on the left, which is the last of the required images for this unit. Crucifixions were entering into the Christian art during the Gothic period, but the crucified Christ was generally portrayed as a triumphant figure who was overcoming death, not suffering a painful execution. An example on the right is this Italian High Gothic crucifixion. But the Rotting Pietà presents the crucifixion in all its pain and terror. It also presents Christ's mother, not as the serene mother of God or the tender, loving Madonna, but as a woman in agony over the loss of her son. So what's going on here? What has changed? Well, both the Romanesque and Gothic periods were actually rather upbeat times in history. Romanesque churches celebrated, among other things, the fact that the world did not end in the year 1000. It was a time when the food supply and the population were growing, towns were re-emerging, and a self-confident Christendom even set off on crusades, admittedly not the church's finest hour. Gothic Europe saw the rise of cities, the establishments of great universities, especially in Paris, and a Christian humanism that celebrated learning and human accomplishment, although always within a Christian perspective. Faith became more triumphant, but it also became more comforting. Again, stay tuned for the new role that Mary was playing in Christianity. While the 1300s or the 14th century were another story altogether. Europe was hit by a terrible new wave of bubonic plague, note this illustration, which killed a third of Europe's population, perhaps 20 million people altogether. The 100 Years' War between France and England devastated much of France. The church experienced its Babylonian captivity, a time when there were rival popes in Avignon and Rome, which, as you might expect, undermined the church's authority. The Ottoman Turks, remember them, conquered much of Eastern Europe, and they advanced on Vienna. They came very close to conquering Western Europe as well, as Europeans feared. And finally, this was a century of terrible climate change. In this case, global cooling, or what is sometimes known as the Little Ice Age. Widespread famine developed as farms became dramatically less productive. These were not good times. So the church and individual Christians responded to this suffering in various ways. The 14th century witnessed a rise in mysticism and a greater emphasis on personal devotion and personal relationship with God, on visions of God, of Christ, and of Mary. If High Gothic Christendom identified with Christ the innocent baby, Christ the ruler, Christ the son of gentle Mary, the late Gothic Christians identified with Christ the suffering servant who had experienced the same kinds of troubles and therefore could help lead us through them. Francis of Assisi was transforming monasticism, sending monks back to the city to minister to the poor, and the suffering of Christ and his empathy for suffering humans was central to the very popular preaching of Franciscan friars. The focus on Christ's humanity and suffering resonated especially strongly in Germany, where intellectual High Gothic humanism had never taken quite as strong a hold anyway. We're going to see more of these tormented Christs in the art of the Northern Renaissance after Christmas. The term expressionism will return in the 20th century. Again, it will be used especially to describe German work, so stay tuned. What stylistic devices does the artist use to convey emotion in this work? Well, the paint or polychrome has faded now, but the torrent of blood would have been a vibrant, dramatic red. The lines of the sculpture are twisted and contorted. The scale is not realistic. Mary is much larger than Christ, kind of turning hierarchy of scale on its head. Maybe this is intended to signal the way Christ has been temporarily diminished in death. Well, I need to move to our final required work, but first I want to look briefly at various ways Christian art has depicted Mary again over time. Now, the fresco on the left is from the Catacombs of Priscilla. It may have been a portrait of Mary with Jesus, but this is debated. It may have just been a mother and child. There were a lot of paintings like that of deceased individuals in the catacombs. Anyway, for the most part, Mary does not feature in early Christian art, but by contrast, Mary as Theotokos, or Mother of God, is a very prominent figure in Byzantine art, especially in art such as icons that were designed for use as personal devotion. Remember, this one was in an Egyptian monastery. Like the Byzantine Christ Pantocrator, this enthroned Mary is frankly a force to be reckoned with. So, for that matter, is her stern, upright, miniature adult son. The gold background and halo also serve to emphasize her holy, otherworldly qualities. This is a Mary that one can be devoted to, can worship, but it's not the approachable Mary that we're about to see. Later Byzantine, that means post-iconoclasm, mosaics of Mary and Jesus from Hagia Sophia, likewise show a regal, unemotional, majestic Mother of God, again enthroned. Really, this is Mary as an empress, a fitting companion for Christ Pantocrator. And here's another image from Hagia Sophia. Now, these images no longer show up on the AP list, but a very popular Romanesque depiction of Mary was Mary as the throne of wisdom. Basically, she's represented as holding wisdom in the form of the incarnate Christ. Now, this Mary remains a rather distant, impassive figure, despite the emotional warmth that I think is inherent in the theme of mother and child. On the other hand, these images do represent an important return to three-dimensional sculpture, which was one of the major developments of the Romanesque era. The Notre Dame de la Belvedere window is very early Gothic. It, too, predates and survived the fire that partially destroyed the cathedral in 1194. And you should see a pretty clear resemblance to the Romanesque Throne of Wisdom sculptures that I just showed you. Again, these divisions into periods are not always as sharp as an art history textbook might make them seem. There are even similarities between this window and the early Byzantine Theotokos icon in the mostly frontal pose and the surprisingly adult Christ child, for example. Both works also direct a light toward the central figure of Mary, but they do it in very different ways. So what differences do you see? Well, the Mary of the Chartres window is the beautiful young Queen of Heaven. Note the unmistakable jeweled crown. It's the very popular Gothic image. She is somewhat less severe, and I would argue less aloof than the Theotokos. And a further contrast is created by the two very different media. Stained glass is the art of lux nova, the new light. Remember that Gothic art is very preoccupied with the mystical theological significance of light, part of Abbot Suger's contribution, and he really inaugurates the Gothic art movement. And so here we see light, sacred light from stained glass window, letting in light from the outside. The icon also is filled with light and directs that light toward Mary, but it's generated internally by the gold of the panel, just as the gold of mosaics in Byzantine art creates an internal and in many ways otherworldly light. So let's fast forward to late Gothic. The image on the right is another popular AP image from the past that doesn't appear on this list, but I wanted to include it because I think to end with the Gothic window is not to show the complete development of depictions of Mary. So here on the right, you see from 200 years later, a high Gothic depiction of Mary. And we see again a younger, softer, more approachable Mary. She's not just holding, she is actively interacting with her infant. And by the way, this is characteristic of later Gothic sculpture. Again, the figures are not just standing there facing frontally. They appear to be interacting with another, to acting out some kind of a narrative, to be in motion. Note that this Mary is still the Queen of Heaven, but she's more human and less regal. Both images reflect the adoration of Mary that characterizes the Gothic era and was especially important to Chartres, hint, hint about your essay, as well as to the Christian humanism of the time. We're also seeing a return to more classical styles of sculpture. Note the contrapposto, the way Mary's weight shifts to hold her baby. The draperies, too, reflect the classical style. Even though this isn't a required work, I could imagine it showing up in the AP exam, and in fact, it will show up on your unit test. So will this work? I was surprised that these statues did not show up on the College Board list because they are old College Board favorites. And you're going to see them on your unit test and therefore, of course, on your test review podcast. Again, note that we are seeing a gentler, more human Mary, and we are seeing figures in high relief, really almost removed from their architectural supports, interacting with each other. Something else interesting about this is that the statues were carved by different workshops and show different styles. The Mary and the angel on the left, the Annunciation scene, are wearing medieval courtly garb, while the figures on the right are wearing classical drapery. Note that not only the clothes, but also the contrapposto and modeling harken back to classical models. The Renaissance is coming, but it won't come till after Christmas break. And finally, we come around again to the Roetgen Pietà and a Mary who is not only human and approachable, but sharing our suffering. The work on the right, by the way, is Michelangelo's Pietà, a work of the high Italian Renaissance. It's not a required image, but it's a personal favorite of mine, so I stuck it in here for a point of comparison. Well, I've been very long-winded, and I still have one more work to cover in this lecture. Both of these are Gothic works, although the manuscript dates from about 100 years after the stained glass window. So what do they have in common? Well, you may have come up with some complicated and sophisticated answers, but I was actually looking for something quite simple. They're very similar in form. I would argue that the illuminated manuscript is echoing the shapes, the organization, the framing of stained glass, but even more simply, they're both about queens. The queen on the upper left of the manuscript page is thought to be Queen Blanche of Castile, the widow of King Louis VIII and the mother of King Louis IX. She ruled France from the time of her husband's death when her son was 12 until he gained his majority. By most accounts, she was a clever and successful queen who dealt successfully with rebellion by nobles and with an outbreak of what the church considered to be heresy. Her son followed in her footsteps. He negotiated important diplomatic settlements. He reorganized the public administration of France and strengthened laws that upheld the power of the king, limited the discretion of nobles and bureaucrats, and enforced Catholic teachings such as prohibitions against prostitution and ordeal by battle. He fought in 2 crusades and was very highly regarded throughout Europe. He was sainted in 1297, the only king to achieve this distinction. So, notice any similarities here? The Chartres tympanum dates from just a few years before the manuscript page and was one of the images of many images of the coronation of the Virgin of Christ and by Christ popping up around Gothic Europe. It's hard to know exactly which way the causality goes, but adoration of Mary as Queen of Heaven coincided with the rule of some strong queens. Some decades later, for example, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine would accompany her husband, the French king, on a crusade, that is, before she divorced him and became the powerful Queen of England, wife of Henry II, and mother of Richard the Lionhearted. So this work was probably commissioned by King Louis IX, and it's making quite a deliberate use of the parallel to the crowning of Mary as Queen of Heaven by Christ to bolster his mother's authority and his own. Note that Louis bears several symbols of royal power. What do you see? Well, there's the scepter indicating his kingly status, topped by the fleur-de-lis symbol of French kings. Louis is holding a small golden ball. It may represent the tribute that French kings and queens would traditionally give the presiding Bishop of Reims upon their coronation. Louis IX, the devout Catholic, sought to uphold the church, but he also pretty unabashedly used the church to bolster his own power. There are some interesting parallels to be drawn here if you want to discuss it if you have time to discuss it further. At the bottom of the page, we see the theologian directing the content of the work, which I'll discuss in a moment, as well as the scribe copying it down. Note that the image of scribes features in earlier manuscripts. On the upper right, we see the Carolingian Ebo Gospel, one of the McConnell Jacobs required works. I don't know if you had time to get to it, but it will show up on your unit test, so in the test review podcast. And the bottom, you see the St. Luke portrait page from the Lindisfarne Gospels. Both of these figures are, of course, evangelists. In talking about the dedication page, I neglected to explain what the term Bible Moralise means. But you read about this in your homework, right? What is a Bible Moralise? Basically, it's a manuscript that combines passages from Scripture with explanatory text that relates these passages to historical events or to moral lessons. Confession time. I could not find any good explanation for the illustrations contained in the roundels on this page. And notice again, by the way, a fairly direct imitation of stained glass, nor could I find an English translation of the Latin text. And I'm not alone in this problem. Several teachers on the AP listserv have complained that it's very hard to get information about this work, partly because the College Board chose a Scenes from the Apocalypse. It is not the one that appears in most art history textbooks. It may very well have been a mistake. Oh well. Any rate, what I think you really need to know about this page is, first, as I mentioned, that the roundels containing the illustrations echo the design of stained glass. So those are the two great two-dimensional Gothic art forms. The elaborate paintings also employ very expensive material and show figures garbed in court dress, part of that high Gothic tradition of sumptuous, expensive production for royal courts. But what would a moralizing Bible have to do with Blanche of Castile, King Louis IX, and religious and political power? Well, if Louis did in fact commission this work, as is generally believed, then he is associating his reign with biblical truth and moral authority. This was not a work designed for general audiences. It was a book created for kings. But in addition to educating a king, his possession of this elaborate Bible sent a message to Louis's nobles and his followers. The French king governed legitimately, and much of that legitimacy stemmed from his adherence to the church, his knowledge of the wisdom preached by Scripture, and his active pursuit of that understanding. Okay, I really have run out of time now, so let me just note in closing that if you blew off the homework on the work on the left, you might want to reconsider. It is one of the works that will show up on your essay test, along with the images from the much earlier Lindisfarne Gospels. For both of these, again, you will be answering a question about illuminated manuscripts, and particularly about the relationship between the illustrations and the text. My final 2 podcasts for this unit will be test reviews. In the first, I'm going to walk through this unit's required churches, reviewing floor plans and that pesky church vocabulary, examining the evolution of church architecture from early Christian through the High Gothic period, and discussing how changes in church architecture reflected changes in religious emphasis and liturgical functions over time. The second test review podcast will address the other image-based and general multiple choice questions. Well, we're approaching the holidays, and I know this can be a tough time to knuckle down and work. You're tired of art history. I can understand that. So here's a promise to cheer you up. There will be no homework over Christmas break. Hang in a little while longer, and you will get some time off. You've earned it.